Hello, this is Professor Laird, and this is Chapter 3 in the Political Ideologies class. We'll be talking about liberalism, which is the philosophy upon which our U.S. system of government is based. This is a lot to talk about in this particular chapter, so I'm going to break it down into two parts. This one will be for Part 1. So let's talk about the concept of liberalism before we get into its inceptions here and how it equates to our different concepts of human nature. The individual is capable of living free out in the world rather than to be constantly dominated by dictators, religious doctrine, emperors, kings, things like that, and that humans are rational, self-interested, competitive creatures. We talked a little bit about rational behavior. That simply means that humans are able to recognize what's in their best interests and how to go about trying to maximize that or obtain that. We're also looking at the concept of equal opportunity for everyone out there to be able to succeed according to their own levels of interests or skills or motivations. So this is achieving that, whether it's through each individual's personal effort or removing obstacles to achieving those goals. So as we've already hinted at, liberalism has its beginnings during the medieval periods when we're coming out of the feudal system. The states are starting to form, the Renaissance. We're on the cusp of the Renaissance. But a lot of things were happening. This is going to be kind of like a synergistic stew of things that all are coming together in this period from around the 14th century on through the 16th and 17th centuries for this to become a bona fide political philosophy that then inspires these other ideologies that we'll be getting into, such as classical liberalism, conservatism, welfare liberalism. But as we get into the Middle Ages and beyond, we're seeing some reactions against religious conformity to the church doctrine. This is part of what's inspiring the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, then the Enlightenment. Also a pushback against this ascribed status of being pretty much stuck in the class in which you're born. There's no chance of you getting out of that particular class at birth. So the systems during these periods were based on rank, order, the estate of the feudal system, the owners that were born into that, the nobles, the lords, and then everyone else was born into a peasant class, working class. So your freedom is simply a matter of your social position that you're born into. So we're pushing back against that as well. And the reason why I spent that earlier lecture talking about the formation of the modern state is because we talked in more detail as to the feudal system, as to how it declined during that 200 plus year period, and then opened the door for other things, including the creativity that was inspired during the Renaissance period. Pretty much, again, we're focusing on the Western European region for the most part. The Protestant Reformation was also a very big part of this complicated equation that leads to this concept of liberalism. I've already mentioned this before, that Martin Luther tacked his 95 Theses on the door of the church. One of the protestations that he had was against the sales of indulgences, which is being able to pay to be forgiven for some sort of moral debt. The church was becoming somewhat of a money-making venture in that respect. Because we're also, printing press is a very important part of this equation that we won't really get into much into this course, but the printing press allowed for the spread of information, spread of knowledge, increased learning. And there was a pushback on that the church was vesting too much authority in the priests. The priests were considered somewhat of the conduit between the people and God. Though Luther did not specifically set out, he did not mean to encourage people to believe whatever they wanted. He was still looking at just reform within the Catholic Church. But the stress that he put inadvertently on individual conscience, that each individual should be able to have their own direct relationship with God without necessarily having to go through a priest, this stress on individual conscience somewhat opened floodgates for a variety of interpretations on the Bible. So therefore, we've got other ideas floating out there within the church, and then that also led to ideas in as far as economic ideas and political ideas as well. Another part of the Reformation was King Henry VIII of England. He was also pushing back against the Catholic Church. He established a national religion, the Church of England, which of course he would be the head of. Now, he just a few years prior to that, he was a staunch supporter of the Catholic Church, but he wanted to get a divorce, and the Catholic Church did not condone divorces, so he started his own church. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but that's part of the story behind it. And so that leads to further incentives for the breakup of the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire. Other things were happening as well as within this Reformation. John Calvin, who was the forerunner or the establisher of the Calvinist denomination, he established a theocracy in Geneva in 1555, kind of advocated for the right to overthrow a ruler who denies the free exercise of religion, particularly their religion. People were breaking up over religion, and then that had other ramifications. So these Protestant reformers unintentionally paved the way for liberalism, a philosophy that would have even stronger influences later on. Calvinism is also somewhat indirectly tied to the spread of capitalism. Calvinism believed in predestination, which means the minute you're born, it's already predestined whether or not you're going to go to heaven or not. Now, you would think, this is what's really ironic or counterintuitive about this, is that you might think that if you already knew that you were predestined to go to heaven, then you would just raise all kinds of hell and do whatever you wanted because it didn't matter. Well, actually the opposite is what happened, in that people who thought that they were predestined to go to heaven, they set out to prove it with their behavior. And one of the things that led to was the concept of a calling, which was what your job is on this earth. And you wanted to do very well at your job. You wanted to be good at your job and respected at your job, whether it was a blacksmith, merchant, or whatever your job was, that was your calling. And so therefore, this work ethic was made acceptable by the religious doctrine. So therefore, then it became religiously accepted to be a hard worker. And if you're a hard worker, then you would make money from your hard work and your good works. This is where the concept of good works comes from. So that dovetailed somewhat conveniently into this new economic system that was growing as well at this time of capitalism, because now the Protestant work ethic really was compatible with this new capitalist system that was in its infancy stages at that time. There was also some revolutions going on around this time, or at least to help set this up. There was a civil war between the British Crown, the monarchy, and the Parliament. So this was part of that push and pull, tug of war within the British system. Conflict over who should be collecting taxes on who we should be religiously loyal to, because there were splits between the Church of England and Catholicism. The Puritans wanted to further remove any more traces of Catholicism from the country, but the The control over power led to these conflicts, these civil wars between the monarchy and the parliament. So it was very conflictual and unstable until the Glorious Revolution, which was a pretty major turning point in 1688. This is where the parliament made an agreement with William and Mary that the parliament would pretty much take over the control of lawmaking, rulemaking. So that's kind of the beginning of our parliamentary type systems, because the U.S. Congress is patterned after the British Parliament. And this was the turning point, so to speak. They also accepted a Bill of Rights, which recognized certain individual rights of freedom and property rights. So that was also a very big landmark as far as shifting over from a monarchical system to a rule of law type of system. Right on the heels of that was the Toleration Act, because we know religion is kind of central to all this. The Toleration Act allowed for freedom of worship, as well as that the government cannot force a religion on its people. And that's actually the very first thing written in our First Amendment to our Constitution, that we have freedom of religion, as well as the government cannot establish a national religion. We still had a ways to go, because in this new system that was forming, Catholics and atheists were still refused toleration for the most part. So we're still incrementally evolving here. Now, another thing that was happening around this same time was Hobbes' work of Leviathan, where he was talking about this new common power that was coming into being, which is what we talked about earlier, the formation of the modern state. That Hobbes was a very forward-thinking philosopher, moral philosopher. And Hobbes' work here is the first major work on the political philosophy of liberalism. So this is the kickstart of it right here with Hobbes' work. He acknowledged that humans' behavior is based on self-interest rather than just automatically, inherently following religious doctrine or the divine commands that they're given to them. That human beings are naturally self-interested, competitive creatures, and that humanity really revolves around the self, not around the people that are calling the shots. Each individual, has their own life that humanity then starts refocusing on. And then these individuals have a natural right to be free, but because we are naturally selfish, naturally competitive creatures, this leads to conflict. So he also felt that because of our inherent desire to survive, well, then we would also put our faith or our loyalty, or that we would obey whoever's in power that is protecting us. And so this is where the concept of sacrificing some of your freedom to this common power that is becoming the modern state at that time, as long as they protect us. And they will protect us from foreign enemies. They will protect us from nature. They will protect us from ourselves, in fact, because we are naturally selfish, competitive. This is a major turning point here. The state is being formed, and we also, if you remember, that the Treaty of Westphalia was 1648, where these new territorially defined authorities in Western Europe were now agreeing to recognize that that's your territory. Those are your borders. Those are your people. Those are your resources. So as long as you take care of your business, I'll take care of my business, and then we will agree to get along if we want to. So Hobbes is saying that human beings would then enter into a social contract to establish that defined territory, that defined political authority. So now we're starting to see the concept of the modern state and people putting their loyalty into that, and then we've got to figure out ways to govern that territory, considering that we're all individuals. Now we're going to fast forward to 16 1790 or so, and this was also happening at about the same time as that Glorious Revolution, where we were seeing the power shift from the monarchy to the Parliament. And John Locke, who was a close friend to Isaac Newton, the one who came up with the laws of probably one of the most influential people on Earth, because of what he came up with. It led to physics and calculus and the enormous amount of benefits that came up out of that. Well, Locke, who was his friend, said, well, perhaps humans are bound by laws of nature or laws of motion as well. So he tried to articulate that, building upon Hobbes' philosophy, saying that man is bound to preserve himself. Obviously, we're self-interested and we want to survive, but as much as he can, preserve the rest of mankind as well, because that would be to our benefits to do that. So he was also expounding on these natural rights and God-given rights, also still Christian-based at that time, but God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. In fact, the Declaration of Independence, which we'll touch on here in a few minutes, talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the original words were life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So they were, I guess, astute enough to change that to happiness. Otherwise, that would have been somewhat elitist sounding to keep the pursuit of property in there. But it certainly, owning property was kind of the heart of your individual self-worth back at that time. And so it's the government's job to protect these natural God-given rights. So now we're taking it to the next level and entering into a social covenant with this power. And people consent to create and obey a limited form of power or a constitutional government. And this work by John Locke is probably the single most important influence on our founding of the United States government. There's no doubt whatsoever that Madison in particular and a few others that were the architects of the Constitution were very much influenced by this work, as well as the work of Plato that we've already talked about and a few others that we'll get into. So part of what Locke was advocating here is the right to worship as one chooses. So we're taking that religious freedom. And then the concept of trusteeship, very important, which means you're trusting into, or you're delegating, or you're electing somebody to represent you in that government. And as long as you are representing us and you're doing what we've delegated you to do, we'll be in good shape. And when you stop doing that, we have the right to remove you. Now, he uses the word revolution, but of course he's not advocating for the overthrow of a government that may make a bad decision or whatever. But if it gets to the point where the government has just abandoned all of these principles and is enslaving you and taking away your rights and your property, well, yeah, then you get rid of them and start back to the original idea that we're talking about here. So the American Revolution, we're, again, fast forwarding a little bit here because even though a lot happening in between, we're hitting these milestones. So the American colonists were pretty much left to look out for their own selves fairly early on. So there was a lot of separation there, more than just the Atlantic Ocean. There was a lot of political separation as well. And in the 7 Years' War, which was also called the French and Indian War, England pretty much left them. Of course, they helped finance it, but they just kind of left them on their own to handle that war. And this is where George Washington came into prominence as well. But after that 7 Years' War, the colonists felt somewhat more independent from Britain and a little bit more emboldened to be their own entity because England was already kind of distancing themselves anyway. But to compound matters, England also begins to levy more and more taxes on them and very little representation in the British Empire. So that taxation without representation kind of starts to build, which is the central issue that's leading to independence. These are just a few: the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Quartering Act, the Boston Massacre, which was a reaction against one of these acts and 5 colonists were killed in the resistance, so that made it even more critical. The British also established even more harsh, what they call the intolerable acts, that even put some military control in certain areas. So it started to get worse and worse. The Tea Act actually granted a monopoly on the tea trade to the British East India Company, and the Boston Tea Party, of course, famously was another one of these acts of protest. So things were building, and then Paine's Common Sense, written in 1776, was also very influential. Talking about government, yes, is a necessary evil, but it should not be intolerable. So again, we're going to have to kind of encapsulate the American Revolution here. But the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776, immediately upon wanting to separate from England, and of course then the Revolutionary War ensued. The Declaration of Independence also states that all men are created equal. Now, again, back in those days, you could take that somewhat literal because men ran the show. So this was somewhat of a compressed version of liberalism. It did not account for the slave population that was already there, or the property qualifications that we've touched on a little bit already, that women were excluded. So we still had a ways to go, despite how incredibly important this phase was. So we have to kind of look at it from that perspective, that in the context of those times, this was a very important landmark progression, incremental to what's going to come after it. Now, we still did not have our two-party system yet, but the Republican or the representative style of government and the liberal traditions, which called for a little bit more pure democracy of letting the people have more say. At this point, they were still very closely entwined. We did not have a separation of parties yet until George Washington left. But the representative or the Republican form of advocates worried about the corruption of the people. So we needed to watch out for that and have good representatives of them in government. Liberals were looking kind of at the other side of that coin, that we got to be careful with the potential abuse of power by the government. So, but as far as policies goes, not a whole lot separating them. Constitution was 11 years later, and we'll talk about why that is somewhat briefly. We don't have a lot of time to get into that in detail, but a lot of stuff was happening right after we were granted independence, and it got somewhat chaotic because all the 13 states were wanting to do their own thing. So there had to be something to bring the states together. Constitution provided for a strong central government with limits on power. And we will talk about the Constitution in the next class. Now, the French Revolution came right on the heels of our Constitution. And interestingly enough, our concern, when you read the Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 10 in particular talks about the concern of a pure democracy and mob rule, tyranny of the majority. So this representative government that was established in the Constitution was really trying to prevent what happened in the French Revolution. The French Revolution is literally an example of what the framers of the Constitution wanted to avoid, and they successfully did avoid that. The French Revolution, however, was very messy. Now, obviously, they were looking at some of the same objections that other countries were looking at, such as the United States, as far as religious freedom. Under Louis XIV, who reigned for longest of any other person in Europe, during his period, the French were required to conform to the Catholic doctrine, so obviously no freedom of religion. And the Enlightenment, which was really one of the instrumental periods that we'll talk about in more detail later on, this age of reason was going to have to overcome the forces of superstition. Another thing that was pushing the French Revolution was this aristocratic privilege that you were born into. Nobles had the exclusive right to high positions in government as well as owning the property. And then political absolutism is that the king is placed above the law. So all of these things, much like the other revolutions that we've talked about, were all kind of coming to a head. And the third estate, which is a term of what the people were called, the first estate being the monarchy, second estate being the church or thereabouts, but the third estate was the people, and the people come together and draft a constitution in 1789. So this National Assembly comes together and they create a constitutional monarchy. So they're trying to create a hybrid with a constitution, but still keeping the monarchy in place. The church lands were then secularized and sold out to break that up, and the revolution ensues. So it starts to become rather chaotic, along with these economic crises. So they create the Republic of France as a result of the revolution, and they execute Louis XVI as well. And then it starts to really get worse. This is the kind of the example of the tyranny of the majority, where somebody's going to have to take control and perhaps even be just another authoritarian. But the reign of terror ensued in the aftermath, and 17,000 people were executed over the next few years to cheering crowds, like a spectacle. The instability was pretty rampant until Napoleon took in charge as a military dictatorship and becoming kind of a self-imposed emperor. So what we see is, because of this tyranny of the majority, the chaos, the mob rule that created this havoc, then the best way to get control of it was a military dictator who then becomes a self-imposed emperor. So therefore, fairly counterproductive that you've got 10 bloody years of revolution and chaos that then results in yet just another form of absolute power. The framers of the Constitution wanted to avoid something like this, and they did. So let's kind of sum up here for this part one. Liberalism also, as I've already talked about, kind of dovetails in with capitalism, because if you want political liberties, you can also get economic liberties out of that. After the fall or the decline of feudalism, we start to see the prominence of the merchant class, the bankers, the currency, the monies, the growing middle class, because more people are working at a decent wage, so you get a growing middle class. Economically, things are changing. What we also have to touch on here is during that colonial period, where the Western European powers pretty much took over the rest of the world for the most part, is that they were using a system of what is called mercantilism, to where it was a state-run economic system, the accumulation of resources, or valuable gold and silver ores, the base of the money supply, to increase your power. So your economic system was a state-run, power-driven system, gaining economic strength at the expense of others. You were going to other lands, and this is where the exploration was being motivated to go out and find resources and bring those home, valuable things, sugars and spices and other things nices. And while they were doing that, they were exploiting the native indigenous populations, virtually slave labor or co-opted labor, in order to establish colonies there and extract the resources. They would even pay off the chieftains or the tribal leaders there with trinkets that were more valuable than anything they'd ever seen in their lives anyway. And they were also granting monopolies to these joint stock companies. I've already mentioned the British East India Company already. And they were tasked to go out, even with military backing, and extract these resources and bring them home to the home country. And they were actually given the right to govern as well as trade with these colonial territories. So for at least 200 years, the system of mercantilism ruled. And Adam Smith, one of the things that inspired his work, The Wealth of Nations, was his opposition to this mercantilist system. But capitalism starts to become more and more prominent. Economic exchange is a private matter between persons pursuing profits. Market system. Mandeville's famous essay, Fable of the Bees, talks about the pursuit of vanity and greed is actually better for society as a whole, because each individual person is trying to make their own lives better, whether you want to call it vanity and greed or whatever, but that has public benefits. So that gained some traction. The physiocrats also advocated a laissez-faire type system to where government should leave the market alone and let the market do what it needs to do. And then Adam Smith comes in and kind of fine-tunes all these things. Obviously, the physiocrats was one of his influence, but Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. He was not an economist. And he was attacking mercantilism and monopolistic behavior and felt like that it would be more productive if each individual could work and pursue their own self-interest, pursue their own talents and skills, and make a living at the same time providing a product that everybody wants and needs. And so therefore fine-tuning that system, which through his work becomes somewhat of the landmark of modern capitalism, that self-interest motivates people to provide goods and services that others want. And this is called the invisible hand. This invisible hand of self-interest and competition, which does not necessarily have to be written down anywhere, that will motivate people to provide a good product at a decent price that people are going to want to buy. With limited regulation, the government would try to stay out of this as much as possible. Banks would be the center of this to provide system of credit, savings, lending, borrowing. Government would just protect the public at large while letting this market system work with tax-supported infrastructure. Very important. Public works, most importantly, education. If you want to look at some of the best arguments as to why education would need to be a public good, well, they're right here in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Tolls, for example, would be more burdensome on people than just a general tax to build roads. So, again, lots of things have happened since Adam Smith's writing where he's looking at creating more of a market system that is driven by individuals, where now we have a kind of an uber capitalist system that's driven by major corporations. So a lot has changed since then. Also advocates for free trade between countries using what will later be called comparative advantage, that whoever can make the product better and cheaper should trade with another country. So he was a moral philosopher, and he rejected Mandeville's selfish system. He was still looking at self-interested individuals, but they were channeling their talents into public benefits. So he was softening that somewhat and talking about human beings as sociable creatures as well as individualistic self-interested creatures. So we have to kind of keep that in mind, that the self-interest would be moderated by that. So this is the end of part one on liberalism. As you can see, a lot to talk about here. So we'll pick up part two after we've talked about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.